So what kind of characteristics would describe Christians you respect most? So I'm happy to take some responses here. So what kind of things, people you really respect in the faith, what are they like? Humility, that's a very big one, yep. 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 Any others? Forgiving, definitely, yes. Yeah. Okay. There's Brian. Anyone else? Kind, yeah. Yeah. The fruit of the Spirit, yes, exactly. Yeah. We're probably all thinking of different people, like someone you really respect who's a good, mature Christian, and describing them basically, aren't you? Yeah. So, and what I forgot, loving, prayerful. Brian said gracious, Bible loving. So it's interesting to see the kind of things that impress us when we look at faithful people in life. Because the things we've just mentioned reflect our priorities, don't they? And our values. And I'm not saying they're wrong, of course, because especially the fruits of the Spirit, they're biblical. But all those things, they're all good things that we've had mentioned. And we should be impressed by those. It's the right thing to be impressed by those. But what I'm getting at is that we should beg the question in our hearts, if this is what moves us, they're the things that move us to be impressed, what kind of things move the perfect human? So who's the perfect human? Jesus. Yeah. Yeah, that's, as I keep pointing out, that's Luke's overarching theme in the book of Luke, is that Jesus is the perfect human, and that's his driving force. But what drives Jesus? What moves him? What things is he passionate about? Because those of us who are believers, as I mentioned before, we're growing into his image, aren't we? That's the plan, is that as we get older, we should be becoming more like Jesus. We want to be more like him every day, and that should be our goal as we grow in faith. So if we see what moves Jesus, the things that really grab him, then we see the direction our hearts should be heading as we grow as well. So, okay, because he set the example. So that's kind of the picture I'm giving there. So he went before us, and now we're following him. So what we will encounter today are two episodes, it's going to be up there, which reveal for us some more detail about what's in Jesus' heart. Because we see that he's amazed at the faith of the centurion. And he's moved with compassion for the widow whose son just died. So this amazement and this compassion, they're deep matters of the heart, aren't they? They're the things that you really feel deep inside. And they reveal to us what God is like. So that's why I'm kind of excited about today's message. We'll see, we get to look into Jesus' heart a bit more. So let's start building up the picture a bit. So if you've been with us the last couple of weeks, you'll recall Jesus gave his big definitive sermon, often called the Sermon on the Plain. Some think it's the same as the Sermon on the Mount, I'm not sure, but that's for debate. But the point of that message was that it's trying to paint the picture of what the kingdom should be like, what it should be like living in that kingdom. And some of his most famous statements in that were, love your enemies. We've all heard that one. And turn the other cheek. But he's done that. He's finished his message. He's set the scene of what he wants, and he's come down. And now we come to verse 1 of chapter 7. So that's where the context is. So after he'd finished all his sayings, that sermon, in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. So he'd been travelling around a bit, but now he's back in the headquarters for this part of his ministry, back in Capernaum. Now, it's on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. You can see I've circled it up there. And that's the same place where he healed the man with the demon and where he called his first disciples. They're on the shore of the sea. So there's some of the things we've seen so far in the book of Luke. But now, it's the same place. He's back there again, and he's about to be approached by a little delegation. So verse 2. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. Now straight away we see that this guy, the centurion who sent these men, he's not your usual cold and heartless Roman military dude. If I can use the word dude, is that all right? Yeah, okay. because he's a bit of a dude, he's a tough kind of guy. Because what this Roman official, in many ways the daily symbol of oppression for the native Jews in that day, what he was doing was getting some Jews to come to someone who would himself only be seen as a Jewish peasant. That's Jesus. He didn't have any money, he was just wandering around. So that's pretty much how Rome would have viewed Jesus, just this guy who might be, he got a bit of a crowd, but not much, he didn't have anything. And he's asking this guy for something. And not only that, look at who he sent. These were Jewish elders. They are the senior and respected men in Jewish society. Okay, so these guys would not normally run errands for anyone, let alone a Gentile army man. Now, I'll make more of that in a little while, but until then, just want to read through the rest of the story so we can learn about it. Learn about it then. But I just wanted to alert you to the fact that the situation is unusual from the outset. Okay, the actual who's sending who and who's coming, and it's very unusual. So let's read it with that understanding. Okay, so verse 4. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him." So this is Jews talking about a Gentile here. "For he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, so a second group, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof." So you can see his humility there, can't you, straight away? He's just a very humble guy. "Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." Keep in mind that he's sent people to say these things to him, and they're doing exactly that. "So when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, 'I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith.' And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well." Now, I've already given you a few pointers along the way as to what Jesus may have been impressed with this guy's response. But really, if you're like me, for most of my life, I did wonder why Jesus responded in such a passionate way about what this centurion said. Sort of on the surface you say, yeah, he's a nice guy, and he trusted Jesus to heal his servant. Good. But how is that very much different to other people in the Bible? But Jesus puts his faith, right up the top. So, as I was pondering this question, I was going through this passage in detail, some things began to emerge about what makes this man's faith so amazing. So, what I've done then is to gather them into 5 headings. So we'll talk about them now, because I think, firstly, we need to discuss this guy's faith, and there's 2 main things. It helps us to achieve what we set out to achieve in this message, which is to get to know Jesus better. Okay, so we get to see Jesus' heart, and therefore we get to know God the Father better, because Jesus is his perfect representative, isn't he? He's if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, he says. But also because it can give us a picture of how our faith should look. So, show us the kinds of things we should be seeking in our own lives as evidence of genuine faith in ourselves. So we'll look at the 5 things now, and that is, what do we get from this passage to show us why his faith was impressive? So the first point was his love for his slave. Now the first point to clarify here is that we are indeed talking about a slave, not just a servant. Because one word for servant is diakonos, and there are others as well. But this is the word doulos, meaning someone even further down the ladder of respect and authority normally. So a servant is generally hired and has some degree of respect and that kind of thing. But a slave, a doulos, is owned by the master. They have virtually no rights, and as personal human beings are practically worthless to the owner. The only real worth they have to their owner is their ability to complete the task they give them, and to do the will of their master. That's their value. That's it. We really need to understand this aspect of the biblical use of the word slave, because I think we do miss out a lot on the understanding of that, because many Bible translations don't use that word slave. They make it servant. And it doesn't really give you the fullness of what that means. But the reason they don't use the word slave is because it's demeaning, and that's why they didn't use the word, when it's really what it is. But the fact is, this young man was a slave of the centurion. And I have to be honest, I don't care how good a worker this guy was. It would be unheard of for any other tough Roman guy, centurion bloke, to show this amount of care for his slave. So perhaps, if he was the best worker he had, he still's not going to usually do this kind of thing. If you lose a slave, or you just go and get another one, So perhaps this was the first thing to impress Jesus about this centurion, that he had a love for all kinds of people, even the lowest, and which was unprecedented in what Jesus had seen up till now. And so, to turn that light on ourselves, do we care for all people that much? Or do we ignore others sometimes because they're considered nothing by society? If we do that, we forget one of the first things that God teaches us in the Bible, and that is that every single human being is created in the image of God. We're all born with the dignity and value of human beings. The only creation that is specifically made in God's image. That's what Genesis tells us. God doesn't say that about angels, only people. God didn't become an angel to save fallen angels, did he? He became a human to save fallen humans. So every person, saved or not, matters to God, so they should matter to us too. So that's the first challenge, I guess, from what the example of this centurion is: do you respect everyone? Second point. The centurion had a close and positive relationship with God's people, the Jews. Again, this was very unusual, as I mentioned before. And it wasn't one-sided. It's because you see in verses 4 and 5 that the Jewish elders were keen to help this man, because they said, he's worthy and he loves our nation and he helped build our synagogue. So they really wanted to help this guy. So they had a healthy respect for him and were willing to go on this errand for him. In spite of their general prejudice against Gentiles, and Rome especially, you read that in other parts of the Bible, what they're normally like. There's a lot of animosity and fighting, or subtle fighting. Because this guy put his money where his mouth was, didn't he? He was behind the building of the temple, which is obviously close to the heart of Jewish life. So he was helping them in that way, putting his money down, in efforts at least. And he didn't just say he supported them, he actually did. He did something. Because if he didn't, he would just prove he was faking it. It was just words. But no, like we all should, if we say we support something in our lives should show it, the way we live. So if we say we follow Jesus, does our life show it? If there's no difference between your life and an unbeliever's life, it might be time to really evaluate where your heart's at. But also here we need to remember that the Jews are God's chosen people. And today we also have the church as God's chosen people. So Israel and the church are today God's two trumpets to call the deaf world. And I know that not everyone agrees with this, but what I'm about to say I believe is very clear from the Bible. There are many who say that the Jews lost their status as God's people when they killed Jesus or when they rejected him. But to that I would say, just remember Jeremiah 31, 35 to 37, which says that only if creation itself gives way and can be fully understood by man will Israel be cast away by God. So as long as the sun's still going around, we're still going around the sun, then Israel is still not cast away by God. And also there's Hosea 5:15, which says that Jesus will only come back for good when the Jews turn to him and call him. Which is a lot of the reason I believe Satan still attacks them today, because he's trying to stop this from happening. And the church, which is made up of Jews and Gentiles, is obviously the main witness of God today in the world. So the Bible describes much about the grand plans God has for both groups into the future. So I say that to make this point. Just like the centurion had love for the people of God in his day, genuine believers today should have that kind of affection for God's people of all flavours today. So this is part of the understanding the heart of our God, which is where the next point comes in, point 3. It's a great understanding of Jesus. This is what the centurion had. Now this one's really the heart of the matter. This is what really is the crux of it. There's plenty of evidence in this passage that the centurion had come to know quite a bit about this itinerant Jew, Jesus, because he'd been going around for a year and a bit. He knew that Jesus had authority. He made that clear in the way he likened his own position to his own position within authority to Jesus' position. So he drew a parallel between his and Jesus' position there, particularly in the way that he could command others to do stuff for him, such as the delegation he sent to meet Jesus. So it would be done without him having to go anywhere. So somehow the centurion had come to understand that Jesus had authority in the same way, same kind of deal, which is why he knew Jesus could heal at a distance without even coming to his house. So this was a recognition of both authority and power on part of the centurion, that Jesus had those things. Though of course they're linked concepts, authority and power are linked concepts. One with authority has the power to do things. So this man Jesus, with authority to command, could command even intangible things like sickness, and as we see soon, death. And they have no choice but to obey him because he has that authority. So whatever else the centurion understood about Jesus, he certainly resonated with this aspect of Jesus' identity and character, didn't he? His authority, because they have some similarities. So the question for us then, I always like to turn it back on ourselves, is do we resonate with aspects of Jesus' character as well, and what he stands for, and the aspects of his identity, who he really is? Do those resonate with us? And what do we really know about him? How well do we know him? Because I mentioned last week about the need for us to build our lives on the right foundation. That's how I finished off last week, because that was about building on the rock. And the rock was Jesus. And what it means to build on Jesus, because that's a little bit of an abstract idea, building on Jesus, but what that means is to get to know him. Christianity is not so much a religion as it's a relationship. We hear that quite a bit, don't we? And that's the truth. Relationship is the core part. And the more you get to know him, the more you get to know Jesus, the more the house of your life is built on him. And the more you become like him, the more you love him. You start being passionate about what he's passionate about. And you increasingly value what he values. And you mature into loving what he loves. So that's just getting to know and love someone. That's what happens. You come together in those things. Now, the centurion was in the very early stages of this kind of thing, we would assume. But the key signs were there. He was on the journey we all need to be on, about understanding who this Jesus really is and knowing him. Okay, the fourth point, one Brian mentioned earlier, humility. Now, on this point, firstly, we should note that in his comments about how his authority correlates to Jesus' authority, did you notice how he started out that bit? We've got that in verse 8. I'll bring that up, verse 8. He started out like this. For I too am a man set under authority with soldiers under me. So his first point there was that he was under authority. Not that he was in authority of others. He said that too. But the first thing he said was that he was under authority. You think if he was trying to impress Jesus, the first thing you'd say is that, I have those under me as well, like the way you do. But no, he comes out with the humble statement about being under authority first. But an even more striking example of his humility is in his willingness to be seen to be vulnerable before others. Now this is something that really has struck me this week. And not just other peers, like his other centurions. He's not willing just to be humble to them. He's willing to be humble before his subjects, the Jews. Because he sent two groups of people to Jesus. And both times he had a humble message, if you read what he said, the message he said. The first one, as we just said, about being under authority. And the second one in verse 6, when he sent his friends to say he wasn't worthy to have Jesus, this Jewish peasant, remember, wasn't worthy to have him come under his roof. And then in the next verse, he said he also wasn't worthy even to come to Jesus in person. And that's kind of hidden in this ESV translation, but that's the flavour of what he says in verse 7, that he wouldn't even come in person. Didn't want to bother him. So, are these really the kinds of statements the representative of the mighty Roman Empire would normally say in front of his subjects? I wouldn't have thought so. No. So you can see this guy is quite different. He's happy to be seen to be humble and vulnerable before even his subjects. So again, to turn that around on ourselves, are we fearful of being seen as weak in front of others? Especially those who might look up to us. Or do we prefer to keep up the facade and be seen as a hero when we're really just being dishonest and not being truthful about what's really in our hearts sometimes? I think this part of the centurion's testimony is quite revealing about the heart of a faithful person. Because pride is a horrible thing. There is good pride, like taking pride in your work or pride in your kids or whatever. But pride where you're fearful of being seen to be weak, or when you try and be something that you're not, that's a stink in God's nose, basically. And very often in the noses of other people too. That smell, spiritual smell, is not good. Instead, we should be like this centurion, and of course like Jesus, who humbly washed his disciples' feet, didn't he? And quietly submitted to the cross for our sake, and even bigger. That's the kind of humility we should aspire to. And I think a quote from C.S. Lewis is quite appropriate here, as it usually is. There's always something from C.S. Lewis to put in there, but this one. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. And so many people confuse those two, I think. And it's a perfect summation of Jesus' humble attitude. It's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Okay, now the last of the 5 points is that he was considerate of others as well. So you can see this in his comment about not wanting Jesus to come under his roof. And just to give the background of that, he knew that in Jewish culture, a Jewish man was not to enter a Gentile house. So being a Gentile, he realised that he would place Jesus in a difficult position to have him come into his home to heal his slave. So that may be part of the reason that he sent a second group to intercept Jesus before he got there. But that kind of thoughtfulness is now not as common as it used to be, is it? Thinking about how you might offend someone else. We're all being more and more trained to look after number one, I would argue, to make sure we take care of our own needs first. Now, of course, there's a place for that, because you can't live by giving everything away to everyone else, and you can't live by giving 100% of your income to the church. That's not good stewardship. But if you think about, like last week, the golden rule, okay, we talked about it last week, do to others what you would have them do to you. So it's approaching any issue by considering the good of others before your own good. That is should be characteristic of the Christian way of living. As Philippians 2 verse 3 says, I'll just bring that up. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Now, that's a really hard thing to do. But I think this is the lesson from this aspect of the centurion's example, to be considerate of others. He was considerate of Jesus by not trying to put him in a compromising situation. So now that we've looked at these things at some length, can you see now why Jesus was so amazed at this guy's faith? This guy was truly an amazing man, an amazingly loving, intelligent, humble and thoughtful guy. That's the things I picked up anyway, so I hope you saw some of that. And do you want to be like that? I do. I'd like to be more loving, intelligent, humble and thoughtful. And he was most probably just a very young follower of Jesus. Jesus' ministry only began, like you said, a year earlier, so he couldn't be much older than that, Christian-wise. But God's working all of this in his own time for all of us. So let's just move ahead as he leads us. Okay, so let's now move on to look at this lady who had been really copying it in life. So she was copying it. So how was she suffering? Well, let's read verse 11. Soon afterward he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. Okay, so that seems pretty clear there. So there was a funeral procession leaving the city to bury this young man as the same time Jesus and his disciples, and he would have had a sizable crowd as well coming with him. They were coming into town. So there was a clash of two crowds in a way, not so much a clash, but they were meeting each other at the city gate. There's a happy one coming in and a sad one coming out. And this woman was sad not just for losing her only son. Obviously that would be bad enough, but she was also a widow. And if you were a widow and sonless in those days, you were in deep strife. Because you needed a male in the house to protect you and provide for you in that culture, and as well as to carry on the family name. So all these things which were very dear to those who were living in the Near East in those days, they'd all been taken away from her. So she was really suffering. She was in pain for many reasons. So what do you think Jesus feels when he sees people like this and people like us who are hurting? How does he feel about that? Does he care? Yes, absolutely does. And does he understand what we're going through? Yes, absolutely. Now he's about to demonstrate how he cares for the widow, but he also certainly does understand what we're going through. Yes, our circumstances are all unique, things that hurt us. But let's remember that Jesus experienced the rejection of his friends, all of his friends. And we also assume Joseph, his father, died at some point in his early years, because he does not mention there at any point in the latter part of his ministry. And he went through the physical, but even more the spiritual and emotional pain of the cross. And if he did all that and got through, we can be sure that he understands our sorrows. So as Hebrews 2:18 says, for because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Hebrews has a bit to say about that, so you can look there for a bit more. But today he helps us by his Spirit, who is sometimes called the Comforter. Have you heard that word, the Holy Spirit is the Comforter? Yep. It's a good word for him, because that's what he does in a lot of it. He comes by and comforts us. But on this occasion, the Comforter is flesh and blood for this widow. So this is Jesus himself. So verse 13. Now when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Now just a minute. If you were in deep, deep sorrow at your only son's funeral, how would you feel if someone came up to you and said, don't cry, don't worry? Would you be a little bit offended? Probably. Because she didn't know what Jesus had planned. That's the trick there. She hadn't asked him to do anything. So that's the interesting point, that she never instigated any of this. Jesus just came up and saw the situation. It was all because of Jesus' compassion. And that's the other part of who Jesus is that I want to highlight here. He understood well the effects of this death on the young man's mother. Life had whacked her from every angle, you could say. So Jesus felt her pain, so he stepped in to do something about it, because he cared for her. He didn't want her to keep suffering in this way. Now, of course, that begs the question, does that mean God always steps in to help our suffering? No. Very often he doesn't. So we can only say that we trust him in that he's working out something even better through the difficult events. But what we can know for sure is that he has the power to do something, if that's the right thing for him and for us. So, since he steps in here, obviously this was in the Father's will. Jesus was always in the Father's will. But his first words, as I just mentioned, were a little bit insensitive, perhaps. You might think, yeah, don't cry. Yeah, okay, sure. But it would only be insensitive if he wasn't able to do anything to back it up. But he was able, wasn't he? He was telling her not to weep because he was about to back up his words with action in what the next thing that happened. Then he came up, verse 14, and touched the bier. The bier is just the thing he's laying on, not the coffin as such. And the bearers stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. So it's interesting there that the pallbearers stopped when Jesus approached. Maybe they knew who he was and wondered what he might do. I mean, normally just the groups would walk past each other, I would have thought. But Jesus may have had a good reputation by this point. But then Jesus gave, like I said, substance to his instruction to the woman not to weep, and he brought her son back to life. So how would you feel right now if you were this woman? You've been trying to get your head around the fact that you were going to have to live your life without your two closest loves. And since they would have been your main providers, you would have very little of anything to live on. But then, all of a sudden, Jesus shows up and you have your son back alive. That's you'd say, wow. I guess you'd feel a mixture of perhaps shock, joy, among other things. It's a whole range of emotions, I'm sure. Maybe this is a dream. But one of the other things she may have felt, maybe what the people feel in verse 16, as described here in verse 16. Fear seized them all. And they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. So it was fear that was described as the overwhelming thought for those who saw this happen, the first reaction, fear. It's not simply that they were frightened, though I guess that's part of it. The word fear there is the idea of being awestruck. Some describe it as a reverential awe. That's the way you can sort of describe that kind of fear. So it's a mixture of amazement and respect and fear in the sense that, wait a minute, who's this guy? I'm not worthy to be here kind of thing. If he can raise the dead, what kind of power are we witnessing here? So that's the kind of response from the people. Sort of a bit taken aback, to put it mildly. So what we have is that the love and compassion which gripped Jesus' heart led him to do something so that fear and awe gripped the people's hearts. And the strong emotions and powerful experiences they went through drove them out to tell everyone. That's what verse 17 says, because you read there that the news about him spread far and wide. Because you see, when you encounter the truth and the majesty and power of God, you are compelled to spread the news, aren't you? Or are you? Yeah? Should be. Because the truth demands a response. You can reject him or you can embrace him. But you must choose one or the other. You don't have the option to ignore him, because ignoring him is rejecting him. So to summarise now, today's passage shows us many deep heart reactions, doesn't it? There's a lot of emotion in this passage today. Convictions which lead to actions in the people involved. So Jesus is amazed at the centurion's faith, and that leads him to healing the man's slave of all people. Jesus is moved by compassion for the widow, and that drives him to raise her son from the dead. And the people who see this are gripped with awe and amazement and fear, and it makes them go and tell the good news about Jesus. So that's the issue for today, is motivation. What's motivating you? Where's your motivation to do something coming from? There are many reasons to act and do something in life, but the fundamental motivation of them all should be Jesus himself. When we truly know him, we're compelled to live for him. If we're not fully living for him, it means we need to know and submit to him more so that his Spirit will work more fully and more strongly through us. In fact, we won't be able to stop it if we're truly convicted by him. Because Jesus lived that example for us, as we saw today, so let's be like him. That's what we're looking for, isn't it? Be like Jesus. And let's also keep in mind what it was that moved Jesus in the first place in these examples. It was his loving compassion in one case, and his awareness of a man's faith in another. That's the opposite order, though, of course. So we must trust that he always cares, and we also must seek the kind of faith that the centurion showed. Because these are the things that move Jesus. And he can help us become like that if we simply let him. Now, it's not about trying to doing things that move Jesus, but it's about knowing what moves him, and then we submit to that. So every day we need to live in that surrender to our living and loving Lord. So that's my challenge for us today. Let's pray. Lord, the challenge is there before us, Lord, to look at our own motivation. Lord, what's driving us to do the things we do? And the evidence is in our deeds, Lord. If the deeds aren't lining up with your standards and what you want, Lord, help us to be able to seek you more closely and get to know you better through your word and through prayer and through meeting together like we're doing this morning. So, Lord, please help us to do this, and please make us better stewards of what you've given us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.